welcome to Untamed Unfiltered, everyone. I am Amanda Nicholson.
And my name is Aaron Provencio, and today we are joined by the president of the Wildlife Center of Virginia, Mr. Ed Clark. How are you doing today, Ed?
I am doing very, very well, Aaron. Hi, Amanda. As you can see over my shoulder, I am at what I euphemistically call my field office, which is my small cabin in the mountains of southern Pennsylvania. And when I say small, I mean small. So it's got everything I need, but it's something best enjoyed in small groups.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today, Ed. I think many of you guys watching out there are probably getting a feel for this Untamed Unfiltered, which we are thinking of as our after the show, where we get to really dive in a little bit deeper into some of the topics that we've talked about in Untamed. So, of course, today we are talking about lead poisoning.
And I'm curious, Ed, when we were going through when you all were going through the episode subjects for season 2 of Untamed, why was it so important for you to have an episode entirely focused on this subject of lead poisoning?
Well, I think the truth is that the Wildlife Center has been talking about the lead poisoning of bald eagles and other wildlife for more than 20 years. I literally went back and found some articles that we had written, back in the 1990s, to be honest with you, when we first started seeing it with increasing frequency. And we've seen a great deal of improvement. But as the eagle population has expanded, we've also seen an increased incidence. So the improvement comes because an awful lot of hunters are getting the message. For example, my friends up here in southern Pennsylvania, very traditional area, very conservative area, but they've been hearing me rant about it for 20 years. And a lot of my friends up here are actually conservation or resource management professionals. So they get it. They really do understand. And so recently the little hunt club, I'm not even a member. I'm just a guest there pretty regularly. They've got a clubhouse just a few miles away. And it was the 100th anniversary of this club, and they ordered a special issue rifle made by the Savage Arms Company that had the stock beautifully engraved with the 100th anniversary logo of this little club. And I'd like to say that there are no members that were around when it was started, but some of them I'm not sure. They've got some people that have been in there a pretty long time. But the very gratifying thing was that the fellow who facilitated the ordering of this provided copper ammunition to a lot of the fellows that bought these new guns. They're state-of-the-art guns. They're really very, very nice rifles. And for some of them, it'll be the first time they ever loaded a copper bullet into a gun. And that feels really, really good. Now, the problem is, as we said in the program, the situation with bald eagles is a good news, bad news story. The bald eagle is probably the greatest single conservation success story we've had with bringing back a species from the brink of extinction. Because when we started the Wildlife Center in the state of Virginia, as an example, there were fewer than 50 nests, and nationwide there were only numbering in the hundreds. Today in Virginia alone, not quite 40 years later, we've probably got 2,000 nesting pairs of bald eagles just in Virginia, and other states are experiencing similar population growth. The problem is the primary habitat of the bald eagle is along the big rivers, here in Virginia, the Chesapeake Bay, the tidal rivers, the James, the York, the Rappahannock. Those are the big rivers that are part of Virginia, going north to the Potomac and then up to the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. The same is true around the Great Lakes and in the Northwest. Populations are really doing well. The trouble is they don't have enough place to live, so they're moving away from their traditional habitat. And that's why all of us, no matter where we are, I'm not near any particular body of water right here at this little cabin, and yet I see bald eagles here. And I have to be aware. And my friends with whom I share and enjoy the woods have to be aware that our bullets don't stop killing just because they stop moving.
Yeah, for sure. And it's so interesting to me that we of course we can see lead toxicity issues for a variety of birds. So we see it a lot in eagles because they're scavenger species. We see it in vultures as well, but over the years we've seen lead poisoned red-tailed hawks and great horned owls, and a lot of different birds that just encounter these very tiny fragments of spent lead ammunition. But I thought it was interesting in the episode, Myron Blosser, who did such a lovely job talking about so many facets of this issue, talked about how bald eagles are emotional birds. He called them emotional birds because of that emotional response that they evoke in people. So in some ways, I don't know, I hate to say, is it obviously not good that they're affected by lead, but is it good that we have such an incredible emotional bird to be like the poster child of this issue?
Well, I think that the bald eagle has been the flagship for conservation for a lot of things. I mean, when we passed the Endangered Species Act back in 1972, and yes, I was working in the field back then, it was because of the impact of chemicals like DDT on peregrine falcons and brown pelicans and ospreys, and especially on bald eagles. Bald eagle is chosen to be our national bird in 1782. And of course, all of us who love eagles know the story that Benjamin Franklin was not really all that much in favor of it because he didn't think the national symbol ought to eat dead fish. But the fact is that we've used bald eagles as in logos and symbols and icons going back as long as North America has been populated by humans, and that indeed predates European settlements. Native Americans considered eagles, both bald and golden eagles, to be sacred birds, and they still do. And that's a good thing, but with most people in society, they've got some affinity to an eagle one way or another, even if it's only that they see one sitting on the top of every flagpole. But it evokes patriotism. It invokes power. If you drive a Harley, it invokes Harley Davidson. If you drink beer, it invokes Anheuser-Busch. If you like Philadelphia football, I mean, it just goes on and on. And there's just no reason not to love eagles. And the bottom line for me is if we can't make not even hard decisions, but meaningful and critical decisions to save our nation's symbol, then we're all doomed.
Speaking of this kind of emotional symbol and these emotional reactions that people have to wildlife such as bald eagles, we often see when this concept of lead ammunition and comes up on social media and people responding, this concept of this idea that, oh, we just need to ban lead altogether. Just let's take lead ammunition off the shelves. Let's take it out the rifles. Nobody should ever touch lead again. And you don't seem to have that philosophy specifically. You don't think that necessarily banning lead across the board is the right way to go, do you?
Well, no, I don't. I don't agree with that at all. I mean, we tried an idea just like that when Prohibition banned the manufacture, use, and sale of alcohol, and there's something real similar there. I mean, the thing with lead ammunition is it's not the existence of lead ammunition that's a problem. It's the fact that lead ammunition is available to wildlife when they're scavenging. I mean, that's just the bottom line. So you can still use lead to hunt if that's just absolutely something you will not stop doing. You just need to be sure that when you shoot an animal, the entrails you leave behind, the remains of that animal that are not taken home as food, or if it's a nuisance animal, the body of the animal is just not left available for scavengers. It's just that simple. But the other thing is people that want to just do these quick fixes. As they say, for every complex, serious problem, there's a simple answer. And there is, and almost all of them are the wrong answer. But with lead, when an attempt was made about 10 years ago to simply ban lead ammunition, the organization behind it in Washington, D.C., was just chocked full of city people that didn't like guns. They didn't know anything about guns. They didn't own any guns. They didn't shoot any guns. And they thought, well, where's the harm in that? Well, the fact is that only about maybe, I'd guess, 1 or 2% of the lead ammunition manufactured is actually used by hunters. The majority is used by the United States military, and close behind that by our police and law enforcement agencies and security agencies. I mean, billions and billions of rounds of ammunition are used in training and conflict, and simply to turn the tap on that without having viable alternatives available just doesn't make any sense. I mean, you call the police because you've got an intruder and they show up with a sharp stick. Well, that's not going to make you all that happy. So we need to think about the implications like that. And again, I shoot thousands of rounds of lead ammunition every year, but I just don't hunt with it. I don't do that much hunting anymore anyway. It's a whole lot more like work than I want it to be at my age and stage of life. It's if Bambi jumps through that cabin window back there and attacks the wood stove, I'm going to be there to defend the wood stove. But the truth is, it's just too easy. It's just too easy to eliminate this problem. And anybody that wants to rationally argue otherwise, I'm sorry, is just plain full of it. The fact is that the cost that keeps getting talked about, not a meaningful factor. In the last few years, I happen to hunt with federal ammunition because one of my best friends works for the company. And the cost differential between lead ammunition, which is traditional and very high quality that federal makes, and solid copper bullets, which they are now taking the lead in manufacturing, we're talking a couple dollars a box of 20 bullets. And people say, well, that adds up. Well, my question is, how bad a shot are you? The last 7 or 8 deer I killed in the last 20 years, I used 7 or 8 bullets. I never need a second shot if the first bullet goes where it's supposed to. And, that one box of bullets will last me a long time. And the truth is $2 or $5 or $10 a year is just negligible. I mean, when you look at the average hunter out there and $500 worth of designer camo Gore-Tex outerwear and $300 boots, shooting a $1,000 rifle and driving up in a $50,000 SUV with a $100 bottle of bourbon under the seat, a $20 cigar in their pocket. And for them to tell me that $10 differential in ammunition cost is meaningful is just baloney. There's just no two ways about it. How much is a bald eagle worth? Well, as it happens, and you all know this well, I've been doing expert witness testimony for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and for the U.S. Department of Justice for more than 20 years. And the specific thing on which I testify is the actual value of wildlife, and particularly wildlife involved in crime. And using an economically valid calculus, I have been able to assign dollar values to adult and juvenile bald eagles, many other species of raptors. I've even had occasion to assign values to walruses and sea otters and polar bears over the years while testifying against criminals. And it's a very precise measurement. And I can tell you an adult bald eagle is worth $10,000. And if you kill one through deliberate action or through negligence, you can expect that $10,000 price tag to pop up when the judge decides how much punishment you're going to get. And for somebody to say $10 for a box of copper ammunition is too much to pay to save the life of a bald eagle, their values are wrong, and frankly, they just don't belong in the woods.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the other interesting thing at play here with the whole just ban lead ammunition, that old argument. I think the big thing at play that Myron really touches on, particularly he worked with us on a lead video that we did and produced last year just to talk more about the issue. And he really got into this this thought a little bit more, which is the very, very human factor that people don't want to be told what to do. So like, oh, ban lead, just take it away. Like that just doesn't sit well with people. And I get it. I also am a kind of an obstinate person. So I think just like remember.
Say it isn't so.
What? It's just
I would prefer to think of you as opinionated and strong-minded.
Sure, I'll take that. But it's just, it comes back to really like, we're not going to solve this issue until we stop like vilifying each other and just being like, ban lead, or like, hunters don't care, or, these really dismissive arguments. Like we need to work together and remember we all have a different facet and different background that we're coming from, but really that we can solve this together.
Well, the truth is that the argument was progressing relatively well. And a Washington-based environmental group called the Center for Biological Diversity was the group that led the effort to petition EPA to ban all lead ammunition, just boom, all at once. And they petitioned under the Federal Toxic Substances Act, arguing that lead is toxic and therefore EPA should regulate it. Well, EPA rejected that ridiculous petition in record time, and within the week, Congress had passed legislation preventing and prohibiting that particular federal environmental statute from being used to regulate or in any way control or manage lead ammunition. Now, the problem there was that it was put forward by people who themselves didn't hunt, didn't know anybody who hunted, didn't have any hunting heritage in their family. And there are many organizations out there. They're anti-hunting and they use a broad brush. All hunters are X. All hunters think Y. No hunters care about whatever. And that type of militant sanctimony is also militant ignorance. And there are, unfortunately, a lot more people out there that just want to make noise and be self-righteous rather than make a difference and be effective. Now, one of the reasons that I've been very active and involved in this is I love it when somebody will say, oh, you're anti-hunting and you're anti-gun. It's like, okay, well, let's find out who's more anti-gun. I'll bet you $1,000 I own more firearms than you do. And I'll donate to your favorite charity or you donate to mine. And somebody will say, oh, I've got a lot of guns. I've got this, I've got that. Well, much to my wife's chagrin, I counted up the other day and I'm somewhere around 120. And before people begin to think that I'm starting a militia, a lot of these are antiques, a lot of these are collector's items. And, bottom line is I just like guns and I like shooting them. I'm trained. I used to be an instructor. I used to shoot in competition, though never very competitively, didn't practice enough. And I've got a shooting range in the basement of my house. I've got a shooting range here at the cabin, just up in the woods, that's 100 yards long. And so I kill a lot of paper every year. But when somebody wants to talk to me about ballistics or the efficacy of copper versus lead, fine, bring it. I'll debate my expertise and compare my experience with anybody that wants to sit down and have a rational discussion. Unfortunately, in this highly polarized political environment in which we're living, it's tribalism 101. And when one of the national animal rights groups came and approached the Wildlife Center and said, hey, we know you're working on lead poisoning of eagles, and how can we help you in Virginia? And my very candid response to them was, please go work in Maryland, because the people whose minds we need to change, for them, it's a lot more about the messenger than it is often about the message. You can reason with somebody, they get it. People with a triple-digit IQ of any measure can figure out that you eat soft, toxic metal, it's not going to be good for you. It's not going to be good for anything else that eats it. And when you get ready to have that rational discussion about knockdown power of a bullet, well, that's not something that your average animal rights person can talk about in a very conversant way without scowling or fainting or something. But the fact is that that's the conversation that is going to change minds.
So it's kind of what you're saying, but I guess what I'm hearing is going back to the question I asked you earlier of if banning lead is the best idea. It's not, but what you're kind of saying is that education and reaching out to those people who have the issues and have the questions and finding ways to answer those questions is the right way to go. Yeah.
Well, and the more we push the idea, the more the idea gains acceptance. It's very much like the environmental movement has been in general. We first had to teach people that the air wasn't clean. Just because you can see through it and you feel it and there are no lumps in it doesn't mean it's clean. And we document and we prove and we bring things to the table and we show people. And this very much the way that national environmental legislation was passed. It was a process. It wasn't just some snap your fingers, no pun intended, silver bullet that slayed the dragon. And that's what we need in this case. And we're making headway because almost all of the major manufacturers now are manufacturing non-lead ammunition.
Yeah, and it seems like a big part of the education, the notion of educating people and getting them to buy into this idea is, I guess it's always important for us to remember that different people learn in different ways, and there's different ways to appeal to them. And to a certain extent, kind of like you said with the air and like cleaning the air, people have to see it to believe it. And I'm hopeful that through this program and through all of the patient stories that we put out there and the videos and this is a real issue. We can see it. We see these birds come in. They have signs of lead toxicity. It's sad and upsetting to see them suffer like that. And then the interesting thing to me was this, in this episode, we explored this idea with the governor's school of having this project with the students, which, man, that was such a good way to let the students experience firsthand and actually see these samples coming in from hunters in the area. There was a great newspaper article when Myron and his students were having this study, and they put out a ton of information and flyers appealing to the hunting community to get them to, bring in their gut piles or their, different sections of the deer that they shot to do this project. And in this newspaper article, it was so great. This one hunter talked about how he was out there, he shot a deer, he dressed it in the field, he left the gut pile, walked away, got like halfway to his vehicle, and then was like, oh my gosh, these students are doing this project, I forgot. And he went back to get the gut pile, and as he got there was a bald eagle sitting on it, eating it, which was like, oh my gosh, wow, you can't envision a more perfect story than that to really drive home the point of this happens. It's a thing.
Well, and I have a friend here in Southern Pennsylvania where I'm spending the weekend who had a very similar experience. He was, I think he was hunting bear. And he got a bear, and it was too large to bring out in one trip. So when he went back, he found a bald eagle helping himself to the remains of his harvest. But yeah, we know it's real because we see it. We know that it's heartrending because we see it. We see these animals come in, beautiful, regal animals that should have a life expectancy in the wild of 30 years. And to see them come in when they're more like 6 months old, that are so heavily contaminated with lead, or young adults that are just reaching their breeding age. And it just breaks your heart, as both of you know well. And it's difficult, though, to convey that to people because it's an academic consideration for most people until they find that bald eagle on the gut pile, or until they find a bald eagle and they rescue it and they bring it in only to have it die in spite of their best efforts because the intoxication was so great. And it's just too easy for so many problems and it was the same for the other environmental contamination problems. When we talked about Superfund, when we talked about clean water, clean air, drinking water, it wasn't until children started showing up with lead poisoning, with mental deficiencies and developmental deficiencies that were related to lead, that people really began to get fired up about some of these issues. And that, I hope our episode will indeed let people know. I think the graphic nature of the study done by the high school kids in Harrisonburg, Virginia. I mean, that's a hunting community. That's an agricultural community. So deer hunting runs deep in the families and in the culture of that area. So they're not out there looking for reasons to bash hunting or hunters. But when they found out that the evidence is overwhelming, and again, I come back to the thing about the messenger being almost as important as the message. These were kids in a science class whose teacher was a hunter, and they got community hunters to donate the samples. There was nothing rigged about this. There was nothing skewed about it. And what they found is invariably, when a bullet was used in the chest cavity of a deer, and if that bullet was a lead bullet, there were lead fragments throughout the body of the deer, both the meat that they took home to consume and the internal organs that were left in the field for the scavengers. And that's just the facts, ma'am. This is what it is. So when somebody wants to tell me about, that doesn't happen to me, there's an entry wound and an exit wound, and so there's nothing left inside. Well, there's somebody that doesn't know anything about ballistics and probably not that much about hunting, because one of the ways they sell lead bullets and one of the marketing tools is how much weight retention does it have? Well, 180 grain bullet going in may come out an 80 grain bullet or 100 grain bullet. That means the rest of that lead is inside that animal, and 80 grains of lead is enough to kill multiple eagles. But it'll leave an entry wound and an exit wound, and you can ignore it if you wish. But those kids did a wonderful job of studying that. And I happened to be there the day they brought the samples in for our veterinary team to x-ray them. And some of these young high school boys that were just all about being a hunter, when they saw those x-rays go up on the screen, they got quiet in a hurry, and their eyes got big, and they just did not imagine what they found.
I know for me, when I first got to the center and I was going through all of my training, and I spent a few days in the hospital with the veterinary team, I had the opportunity to help them restrain and do some treatments on an eagle that came in with lead poisoning. And it was a very eye-opening experience for me, and I wrote about it in a piece a couple months ago. Because for me, I mean, I'm new to the field of wildlife veterinary medicine, so it's still novel for me to see any wild animal in those kinds of conditions, but especially an animal like a bald eagle, like we were saying earlier, that's so majestic and so recognizable with the wilds of North America, to see this animal limp and not being able to control its head and strapped to an IV and holding it there and realizing that the only reason this thing is here is because somebody somewhere just happened to make the wrong or uneducated decision, was jarring to say the least. And it was a really, really interesting experience, because it took an issue that I'd never even heard of. I'm not a hunter. I've never even really been around a gun in my life, much less target shooting with some friends. And so it was really interesting to have that experience as a new member of the team at the Wildlife Center. And it definitely gave me a new perspective on this issue. And I'm curious, Ed, are there any experiences or any particular cases that you remember involving this lead poisoning concept that kind of really stick out to you, your time at the center?
Well, it's the sad reality is we get an awful lot more birds that don't survive lead poisoning than the percentage that do survive lead poisoning. It's a bad situation. think the one that I found most heartbreaking of this, I mean, they're all devastating. I can't imagine how the veterinary team will get in 4 or 5 bald eagles in a week, as has frequently happened, and euthanize every one of them, just because there's no hope. I forget where the bird had come from, but we had a bald eagle that came in with relatively high lead levels and yet not off the charts. And they started treating it. It was an adult bird, treated it for months and months and months, and finally got it back to where it could maintain its balance, hold its head up. All of its muscles were working. It had a broken wing. That was fixed. So it was in captivity for months. I think probably 7 months, something like that. And as soon as the bird was transferred to the big 100-foot-long flight cage, it became obvious that the bird was never going anywhere. The wings were fine. The bones were healed. But the lead in its system had done so much damage to its internal organs that it literally did not have the physical stamina to fly 100 feet. And after 7 months of working on it, the bird had to be euthanized. And it's just so tragic. And the thing that is so infuriating is it's 100% preventable. And if we could just kind of sort through the issues that are out there and get down to a discussion of the facts and the science and the reality, I really believe we could solve this. But they don't like hunting. They don't think it's fair. They don't this, they don't that. Well, that's fine, but it's legal. And until it's not, and that's going to be a long time, because in many states, including Virginia, the right to hunt and fish is in the state constitution. I've been at this long enough to know that sanctimony is cheap. Effectiveness takes a lot more work.
And speaking of some other good eagle stories, as you noted, when we get these lead poisoned birds come in, I mean, sometimes they just die quickly because it's a big problem. I think as you mentioned in that really sad, frustrating story, sometimes lead doesn't outright kill them, but it prevents them from being released and ultimately kills them because they have permanent neurological deficits. So this past spring, actually just last month in April, we released a bald eagle that had come in earlier this year, and it had high lead levels. Like, its lead level was 8 point something ppm when it first came in. And the release was a relatively low-key event. It wasn't our big normal public celebration because we're in the midst of this pandemic and can't gather. But how surprised were you when that bird went back to the wild? Because I was floored. I mean, I'm going to say I get a little jaded. So when they were treating that, I was like, well, that bird is never going to make it. That lead is so high.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about lead poisoning is essentially we deal with 2 types of poisoning at the Wildlife Center, and all people who care for lead intoxicated wildlife, and particularly birds, do as well. If we have what is called an acute poisoning, and acute mean happening right now. That bird has been out, has eaten something that was contaminated with lead, or it has ingested lead. That gets into its stomach and gets into its bloodstream very, very quickly. But the level in its blood can be extremely high for a short period of time, few days perhaps, and that alone can knock him out. But as long as it hasn't really infiltrated his bones and his internal organs, when the lead is still in the blood, that's where it's most accessible, and that's where the treatment can really be effective. Why, we were able to save that bird. Had that bird not been treated immediately, and that lead in its blood had insinuated itself into the internal organs, been absorbed by the calcium in the bones, he'd have died. There's just no question about that. But that's also why when we get another bird in that may have half the level of lead in its blood and still die, it's because the lead didn't remain in his blood. So had that bird not died from that high level of lead, and that lead had left its bloodstream, bonded with the calcium in the bones, gotten into the internal organs, its blood lead level would have dropped, but the toxicity of the lead would have become more critical. So that's why time is of the essence. When I was in my much younger days, an emergency medical technician, they taught us that there are three really life and death situations: bleeding, breathing, and poisoning, that require dramatic measures, and time is of the essence. And, and of course, that's a little oversimplified. There are, of course, many others. But if you stop breathing, you're not long for the world. If you have profuse bleeding, you're not going to be long for the world unless that bleeding is stopped. And if you have acute poisoning, unless you are treated for that poisoning by whatever appropriate means is necessary for the poison, you're not going to live to recover. And so in that case of that bird, it was very, very high level of lead. That bird was blessed in the sense that somebody found him, got him to us, and our team knew what to do and do it quickly.
Awesome. Well, Ed, thank you so much for joining us today. Do you have any parting wisdom or advice for people in general as we continue to deal with this issue?
Well, as I mentioned somewhat in the episode, sometimes it's just getting people to take the first step. And, if you've got hunters in your family, or people that hunt, or your neighbor hunts, or whatever, find out what firearms they use and buy them a box of copper ammunition. Hunters claim to be conservationists, but you have to walk the walk, not just buy your hunting license.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Ed. This has been another episode of Untamed Unfiltered, and we will see y'all next time. Bye, everybody.